After that, another officer, Tomsky, suddenly notes that while Herman's behavior doesn't surprise him, he's curious why his grandmother doesn't gamble. "But what's so astonishing about an old lady of 80 not gambling?" asked Narumov. "Then you don't know?" "No, indeed, I know nothing." "Oh well, listen then." Hello and welcome to the first episode of my new video series RU-Lit, Russian Literature, where I talk about the texts that are less known outside of the Russian-speaking world. Please make sure you hit that like and let's start. You might have heard about Alexander Pushkin, a poet, a writer and a historian of the early 19th century. His legacy is huge. And for the Russian literary canon, he is considered to be not only the greatest poet of all times, but also a founder of a new literary style. Thanks to his poetry and prose, Russian literature started transitioning from the archaic and heavy lexicon of the 18th century to lighter and more modern style of the 19th century. Pushkin was an innovator in the sense that he started using common words instead of the high-style lexicon in his poetry. Born in an aristocratic family, he was well educated. He started writing very early, demonstrated signs of a genius while he was still in his teens. In his adult years, he wrote dozens of poems, as well as such seminal work as Eugene Onegin, the poem and verse, and Little Tragedies, short drama pieces. Being very active politically, he sided with the Decembrist movement, which was the first group that tried to go against the regime. So they prepared an uprising in 1825, but failed, and many people were sent to Siberia, and 5 of the leaders of the movement were executed, which was the great shock for Pushkin himself, because they were his friends. But he was sent to exile. After a while, he got pardoned by the Tsar and could go back to the city. His personality was explosive. He participated in several duels that eventually led to his untimely death at the age of 38, so he was killed in a duel himself. Aside from Eugene Onegin or his poems, he wrote amazing prose, very laconic, dense and beautiful, which I really recommend checking out. They read quite well in English as well. If you are an opera fan, I am sure you have heard about The Queen of Spades, a famous and beautiful opera by Pyotr Tchaikovsky, often staged at the theaters around the world. Have you seen any productions of this opera? I haven't, but I grew up listening to the old recording of The Queen of Spades on our turntable. Anyway, if you know this opera, you might remember the plot. The idea of 3 fateful cards that guarantee a gambler a win. The ardent love between Herman and Lisa, a poor warden of an old countess, and the motive of madness that destroys all hope for a happy ending. But keep in mind that this is a libretto, with major changes to the story's characters, some plot points, and most importantly, the spirit of Pushkin's tale. So what happens in this Queen of Spades? I will give you a short summary, trying to avoid spoilers, just in case you end up reading this story. It is a short piece, but truly dense, as all Pushkin's prose, and so I am convinced that it's truly worth reading. In this story, a group of young men, most of whom being from the army, gathers one night over a card game. One participant, an engineer officer, observes the game without intervening. When his companions ask, "Why does Herman never gamble?" he responds, "The game fascinates me," said Herman, "but I am not in a position to sacrifice the essentials of life in the hope of acquiring the luxuries." This is a perfect illustration of Herman's personality. He is cautious and prudent, but at the same time obsessed with the idea of gambling and winning. This clash between 2 aspects of his personality will become a core point of his drama. After that, another officer, Tomsky, suddenly notes that while Herman's behavior doesn't surprise him, he's curious why his, and then there is another piece from the text, grandmother doesn't gamble. "But what's so astonishing about an old lady of 80 not gambling?" asked Narumov. "Then you don't know?" "No, indeed, I know nothing." "Oh well, listen then." And he tells his companions about his grandmother, who in her young years had an unlucky card game and owed a great sum to another player. Her husband refused to give her money, and in desperation she turned to Count Saint-Germain, who had a reputation of a powerful magician. Saint-Germain was a real person, widely known in the 18th century Europe. The Count gave the Countess 3 cards that she had to bet on, and indeed she won 3 times, thus being able to double her money twice and to pay off her debt. However, she never revealed the secret of 3 magic cards to anyone, save for one young man she took pity in. Now, here I will pause. Did you notice that this story revolves around this theme of card games? It is not an accident. Gambling was one of the most popular activities of the early 19th century Russia, especially for men and especially for army officers. Practically all books that came out in the first half of the 19th century featured 2 things that plagued Russian society of that time, namely duels and gambling. Gambling, card game, very often preceded duels and caused all kinds of disasters in people's lives, when they would lose all their money. For many Russian writers, gambling is one of the dangers that awaited young officers at the front. We see it in Pushkin's longer story, Captain's Daughter, where the very young man goes out into the world and immediately loses all his money in card game to an officer. Or in Nikolai Gogol's Gamblers, or in Tolstoy's War and Peace, where one of the heroes goes to war and loses huge sums of money again to an older officer. Ian Helfand, an author of multiple works dedicated to gambling in Russian literature, once wrote, "High-stakes games of chance became a primary behavioral arena, and correspondingly a recurrent theme of literary presentation, in which men could test themselves against each other and against fate, knowing that their performances would be judged by other men according to the standards of an idealized masculine behavioral code." And indeed, being a master of gambling rated as one of the most important skills in the military and aristocratic circles. Here is what Prince Pyotr Vyazemsky, one of the leading romantic poets, wrote about gambling. "Nowhere cards are so widely used as here. In Russian life, cards are one of permanent and unavoidable elements. Card game in Russia is a standard of any person's moral stance. He is a good gambler. This praise is enough to bring a person into a society. If someone gets sicker or weaker, it might go unnoticed. However, if a gambler loses his ability to play, it would quickly raise suspicion and pity." I'm sure many of us can draw parallels with today's issue, such as, again, gambling, or, to put it more broadly, addiction. In a sense, one of the ways of looking at the Queen of Spades is exactly like this, the theme of obsession, addiction, that can lead to all kinds of disasters, not just in gamblers' life, but also in lives of other people that surround them. So join me next time to hear more about Herman's addiction, the clash between 18th and 19th century embodied in the figure of the old countess, and a poor girl who becomes a pawn in the big game. Thank you so much for watching this episode. If you liked it, please make sure you like and let your friends know. Thank you so much. See you next time.